The black teacher at the daycare center slept on the floor with the baby. The billionaire saw it. And then what happened? This is unacceptable. An employee sleeping on the floor like an animal. Principal Patricia's shrill voice echoed through the hallway of Elite Gardens Preschool at 6 o'clock in the morning. Call security immediately. Kesha Johnson slowly opened her eyes, still lying on the colorful carpet of the nursery. In her arms, little Thomas, only 8 months old, was sleeping soundly for the first time in 3 days. She didn't move. She didn't justify herself. She just looked at the principal with a calmness that only exists in those who have weathered much worse storms. You know that children with special needs require different care, Kesha said softly, stroking the back of the baby who suffered from mild cerebral palsy. Thomas can only sleep when he feels constant human warmth. Patricia snorted, adjusting her expensive blazer. Don't give me excuses. This is a prestigious institution, not a shelter. Parents pay $40,000 a year for their children to receive professional care, not this. Outside, a black Bentley pulled discreetly into the parking lot. Jonathan Blackwell, CEO of Blackwell Industries and father of little Thomas, had arrived earlier than usual to pick up his son. Through the window, he watched the whole scene without being noticed. Kesha was only 26 years old, but she carried the responsibility of supporting 3 younger siblings after her parents died in an accident. With a degree in special education with honors, she had accepted the job at the elite daycare because it paid triple what any other institution would offer. What she didn't expect was to discover that her degree meant less than the color of her skin in that environment. Gather your things. You're fired, Patricia declared coldly. Inappropriate behavior and violation of institutional rules. That's when something interesting happened. Kesha smiled, not a smile of resignation or humility, but something different, as if she were keeping a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right time. Sure, Miss Patterson, but first, I need to wait for Thomas's father to arrive. Security protocols, you understand? What Patricia didn't know was that for the past 2 months, Kesha had meticulously documented every irregularity at that school. From teachers leaving children alone to smoke to the overbilling scheme. That inflated parents' bills by thousands of dollars a month. If this story of injustice and determination touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because what happened when that billionaire finally entered the room would not only change Kesha's life but expose secrets that the entire elite preferred to keep buried. Jonathan Blackwell pushed the living room door open silently, his $3,000 Italian shoes making only a whisper on the waxed floor. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. His private housekeeper had reported that Thomas had been crying incessantly for days, but there was his son sleeping peacefully in the arms of a woman he had never seen before. Mr. Blackwell, Patricia practically shouted, her face turning red. What a terrible coincidence. I just caught this employee violating our most basic protocols. Rest assured, she will be removed immediately. Kesha stood up carefully, holding Thomas as if he were made of crystal. Her eyes met Jonathan's, not with submission or fear, but with a dignity that made him hesitate before speaking. Daddy. Thomas had woken up and was reaching out his little arms toward his father. But when Jonathan approached to pick him up, the baby started crying and clung tighter to Kesha. This is absolutely unacceptable. Patricia continued, her shrill voice cutting through the morning air. Mr. Blackwell, you need to understand that this woman was sleeping on the floor like an animal. What kind of example does this set for the other children? Jonathan watched the scene with growing confusion. Thomas had never been this attached to anyone, not even the 3 highly qualified nannies he had hired on the recommendation of Elite Gardens itself. Kesha finally spoke, her calm voice cutting through Patricia's hysteria. Mr. Blackwell, Your son has sensory difficulties due to mild cerebral palsy. He needs constant contact to regulate his body temperature and feel safe. The other teachers," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "prefer more distant methods, more professional methods." "We are not a regular daycare center, Mr. Blackwell," Patricia corrected sharply. "We are an elite educational institution." It was then that Jonathan noticed something interesting. Kesha didn't seem surprised or desperate as someone who had just lost her job should be. There was something in her eyes, a quiet certainty that intrigued him. 3 months earlier, Kesha had taken that job out of financial desperation. Her parents had died in a car accident, leaving her responsible for 3 teenage siblings and a mortgage that consumed 80% of her income. Elite Gardens paid $42,000 a year, much more than any public school. But from day one, she had sensed that something was deeply wrong with that place. The children with special needs were systematically neglected. Less qualified white teachers were given the best shifts and the smallest classes. And Patricia had a very particular system of discipline for families who questioned her methods. "Mr. Blackwell," Patricia said, adjusting her blazer authoritatively, "I assure you, we will find a much more suitable replacement to care for Thomas, someone who understands our standards." Kesha gently stroked Thomas's back, who had stopped crying completely in her arms. "Of course," she replied, but there was something in her tone that made Patricia frown. "I'm sure you'll make the right decision for your son." Jonathan looked at Patricia, then at Kesha, then at his son, who was clearly calmer than he had been in weeks. Something wasn't right. In 16 years of building a business empire, he had learned to trust his instincts. And right now, all of them were screaming that there was much more going on here than met the eye. "Patricia," he said slowly, "I need to talk to you two separately before I make any decisions." What Patricia didn't know was that during those 3 months documenting irregularities, Kesha had discovered something much more serious than child neglect. She had found evidence of a fraud scheme involving systematic overbilling, ghost teachers on the payroll, and embezzlement of funds intended for children with special needs. Most interestingly, she knew exactly who was behind it all and had the evidence stored in a very safe place. While Patricia talked about institutional standards and professional conduct, Kesha smiled to herself because what that arrogant woman had no idea was that every prejudiced word, every discriminatory attitude, and every cruel decision had been carefully documented. And now, with the most powerful witness possible present in that room, the perfect moment to reveal the whole truth was finally arriving. 2 hours later in the Elite Gardens conference room, Patricia meticulously organized a folder of false documents about Kesha's inappropriate behavior. She had called an emergency meeting with 3 influential mothers from the school board, all wives of powerful executives who paid the highest tuition fees. "We need to act quickly," said Patricia, adjusting her glasses authoritatively. "This employee clearly does not understand the standards of our institution. Sleeping on the floor like an animal, it's unacceptable." Mrs. Davidson, the Attorney General's wife, frowned. "Patricia, are you sure you're not overreacting? Jonathan Blackwell is one of our biggest contributors. That's exactly why we need to protect him," Patricia replied firmly. "Imagine if the press found out that the school taking care of a billionaire's son employs people like that. It would be a scandal." Meanwhile, across town, Kesha was sitting in a small cafe with her younger brother, Marcus, a 22-year-old investigative journalism student. On the table, dozens of documents were organized into neat piles. "Sis, this is dynamite," Marcus said, leafing through the evidence Kesha had collected. "Overcharging for teaching materials, ghost teachers receiving salaries, embezzling funds for special needs children. Patricia is stealing almost $200,000 a year," Kesha nodded calmly. "And there's more. She has a system of extra fees that she charges parents of children with special needs. She emotionally blackmails them, telling them they need to pay for additional care that is actually required by law. Marcus pointed to a specific spreadsheet. Look at this. She charges Blackwell an extra $3,000 for specialized sensory therapy for Thomas. But you told me there was never any therapy. She just let the baby cry in the nursery while the other teachers pretended not to hear him. Exactly, Kesha confirmed, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from contained indignation. And when I started taking proper care of him, she became furious because she knew I was finding out the truth. Over the past 3 months, Kesha had used her skills in educational technology to discreetly access the school's internal system. Every irregularity, every suspicious transaction, every moment of child neglect had been documented with scientific precision. She had photographed documents during her night shifts, recorded incriminating conversations on her cell phone, and even gained access to Patricia's internal emails. Marcus closed the last file. You have enough material to destroy not only Patricia, but the entire board that's covering this up. The question is, what do you want to do with it? Kesha smiled, the same enigmatic smile she had flashed the previous morning. Remember how Dad used to say that patience is the most powerful weapon of the intelligent? Yes, but, sis, Patricia has no idea who she's messing with. She thinks I'm just another black employee desperate for a job. She doesn't know that I graduated magna cum laude in special education, that I speak 3 languages, and that I spent 4 years working as an educational consultant before taking this job. The next morning, Patricia called Kesha in for a final termination meeting. The room was packed, the school board, 2 influential mothers, and even a school attorney. Everyone looked at Kesha with a mixture of pity and contempt as she entered, carrying only a simple folder. Kesha, Patricia began with false compassion. After careful consideration, we have decided that your educational approach does not align with our institutional values. You're fired. Effective immediately, Kesha nodded quietly. I understand completely, Miss Patterson. In fact, it's amazing how intelligent people can make such rash decisions. Patricia frowned at Kesha's calm and slightly ironic tone. Rash? I don't understand. Oh, it's just that I received a very interesting phone call last night, Kesha said, slowly opening her briefcase, from the State Department of Education. It seems that someone has made an anonymous report of financial irregularities and child neglect at the school. Patricia's face paled instantly. That's ridiculous. Who would do such a thing? Kesha smiled again, taking an official letter out of the envelope. Well, as you'll find out in approximately... She glanced at her watch. 15 minutes. When the investigators arrive, they have very detailed evidence, documents, photographs, audio recordings, a 3-month investigation, in fact. Meanwhile, Jonathan Blackwell was in his office when he received a call from his personal lawyer. Jonathan, you need to know that there's an investigation underway at Thomas's school. Fraud, child neglect, systematic overbilling. And the teacher who was fired this morning, apparently, she's the one who provided the evidence. And Jonathan, she's not just any teacher. Impeccable credentials, multiple specializations, consulting experience. She's been documenting everything for months. At that moment, Jonathan realized he had witnessed something much bigger than a simple unfair dismissal. He had witnessed the moment when an extraordinary woman decided it was time to reveal the truth. Back in the conference room, Patricia tried to maintain her composure as she watched Kesha calmly organize more documents on the table. You can't prove anything, she stammered, but her voice was shaking. Actually, Kesha said softly, I can prove everything. Every penny stolen, every child neglected, every lie told to parents. And the interesting thing, Patricia, is that the person who will be most interested in this evidence is the very person you tried to use against me today. She pointed to the window where a black Bentley had just pulled up. Jonathan Blackwell was getting out of the car, accompanied by two men in suits who were clearly not ordinary lawyers. Because, let me tell you something, Kesha continued, her voice remaining calm as chaos erupted around her. When you mess with someone who has spent months meticulously documenting every crime you've ever committed, you're not just getting fired from your job. You're about to find out that some people don't get revenge with anger. They get revenge with irrefutable evidence, surgical strategy, and perfect timing to ensure that justice is not only served, but watched by all the right people at the exact moment your mask finally falls. Federal investigators entered Elite Gardens like a silent tsunami. Agent Sarah Mitchell of the Department of Education carried 3 boxes of evidence and an expression that made Patricia break out in a cold sweat. "Miss Patterson," the agent said, showing her ID, "we have a search warrant. We also have some questions about financial discrepancies reported at your..." Patricia tried to maintain her composure, but her hands were shaking visibly. This must be some kind of misunderstanding. Our school has had an impeccable reputation for 15 years. 15 years of systematic fraud, actually, Kesha corrected calmly, opening her briefcase and spreading documents across the table. "Agent Mitchell, here are the originals of everything I sent anonymously last week." Jonathan Blackwell entered the room at that exact moment, accompanied by his personal lawyer and a forensic accountant, his expression that of someone who had just discovered he had been deceived for a long time. "Patricia," Jonathan said, his voice sharp as ice, "I just got a very interesting call from my accountant. It seems I've been paying for specialized therapy for Thomas that never existed." Kesha stood up, meticulously organizing documents like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Mr. Blackwell, over the past 3 months, I have documented that Elite Gardens charges an average of $2,800 extra per month from each family with special needs children money for services that were never provided." She pointed to a specific spreadsheet. "Your bill shows a charge of $3,000 a month for specialized sensory therapy. In reality, Thomas spent hours crying alone in the nursery while the teachers completely ignored his needs." Patricia tried to interrupt. "That's a lie. This woman is trying to get revenge for being fired fairly." Kesha smiled, but there was no humor in her eyes. She turned on her cell phone and put it on speaker. Patricia's voice echoed clearly through the room. "These special kids are a financial burden. Their parents pay less in taxes because of medical deductions, so we have to make up for it in other ways. Make up whatever extra fees you need. They're too desperate to question it." Patricia's face turned white as a sheet. You illegally recorded me." "Actually," Agent Mitchell said, consulting her notes, "at staff meetings, recordings are permitted for educational purposes. According to your own employee handbook, page 43. Kesha continued relentlessly, turning another page of evidence. "I also have complete documentation on the ghost teachers, 5 employees receiving full salaries who never set foot in this school." Patricia pocketed $120,000 a year just from this fraud. Jonathan took one of the sheets, his eyes scanning the numbers with growing outrage. 3 years. We paid $320,000 in 3 years, believing Thomas was receiving the best care possible. "And there's more," Kesha continued, her voice maintaining its professional tone as she methodically destroyed Patricia's life. "Federal funds earmarked for children with special needs. Patricia diverted 80% of that money to her personal account. I have bank statements, wire transfers, everything." Mrs. Davidson from the school board had fallen completely silent, realizing she had been sitting next to a criminal for years. "Patricia, is this true?" Patricia tried one last card. You can't trust this woman. She's just a resentful employee who has a master's degree in special education. Magna cum laude from Columbia University, Jonathan interrupted, consulting his phone, who worked as an educational consultant for the New York Department of Education for 4 years before taking this job, and who could be making 3 times as much anywhere else. Agent Mitchell stood up. Mrs. Patterson, you are under arrest for federal fraud, embezzlement, and aggravated child neglect. The handcuffs clicked with a metallic sound that echoed through the silent room. This can't be happening, Patricia muttered as she was led away by the agents. You don't know who you're messing with. I think I do, Keisha corrected softly. Because when the families find out that their children were neglected while you were stealing money meant for their care, those connections are going to disappear very quickly. Jonathan looked at Kesha with a completely different expression. You planned all this from the beginning. No, Kesha replied honestly. I just wanted to work with children and help my family. But when I saw how Thomas and the other special children were treated, when I saw Patricia stealing money that was supposed to ensure proper care for them, well, I found I couldn't stay silent. Jonathan's lawyer approached. Miss Johnson, our firm would like to discuss some opportunities. What you did here today saved not only the school, but probably hundreds of children in similar situations. Kesha looked out the window where Patricia was being put into the police car. Reporters had already arrived, cameras capturing every moment of the arrest of the principal, who for 15 years had built an empire based on exploiting vulnerable families. You know what? Kesha said, grabbing her briefcase and heading for the door. When I woke up sleeping on the floor with Thomas this morning, my only concern was making sure he finally got some rest. I never imagined that moment would become the catalyst for exposing years of crimes against defenseless children. She paused at the door, looking back one last time. Patricia was right about one thing. I didn't really understand the standards of this institution because my standards have always been about protecting children, not profiting from their suffering. As sirens echoed outside and camera flashes lit up the windows, one question hung in the air. Was it possible to completely rebuild an institution corrupted by years of systematic neglect, or was there damage that even the most thorough justice could not repair? What would Kesha do now that she had exposed a network of corruption that went far beyond a simple private school? 6 months later, the national newspaper headline read, Former elite school employee founds Revolutionary Institute for Special Children receives $50 million investment. Keisha Johnson sat in her new office, a large bright room in downtown Manhattan, surrounded by honorary degrees, certifications in inclusive education, and a framed photo of Thomas taking his first independent steps after months of proper therapy. Jonathan Blackwell entered carrying 2 coffees and a genuine smile. The first quarter numbers are in. 23 schools have already implemented our sensory care protocol. 215 special children are receiving proper treatment. And Patricia? Kesha asked, accepting the coffee. Sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud and 3 more years for aggravated child neglect. She lost her house, her cars, even her pension. She's working in the prison laundry for $2.50 an hour. Kesha nodded without showing any malicious satisfaction. What about the other families who were harmed? They all received full compensation. The restitution fund we set up has already distributed $4.5 million. The children who were neglected now have access to top-notch therapy at no cost to their families. 3 months after Patricia's arrest, Kesha had received calls from dozens of parents, not just from elite gardens, but from similar schools across the country, stories of abusive billing, systematic neglect, unprepared teachers, and principals who prioritized profit over child care. We want you to help us, said Mrs. Rodriguez, mother of a 6-year-old autistic child. You were the only one who had the courage to speak the truth. The only one who documented everything and took action. That was how the Kesha Johnson Institute for Inclusive Education was born, not just a school, but a training center for teachers, a laboratory for developing specialized protocols, and an oversight organization that audited schools suspected of abusive practices. Jonathan had offered $10 million in initial funding. Kesha accepted, but only as an investment, not as a donation. I want to build something sustainable, she had explained. Something that doesn't depend on the goodwill of billionaires to survive. Within 9 months, the Institute was serving more than 400 children directly, and had trained 237 specialized teachers. The Johnson-Blackwell Protocol for Sensory Care had been officially adopted by the Department of Education in 3 states. There's one more thing, Jonathan said, handing her an official envelope. This arrived today. It was an invitation from the National Congress. Kesha had been invited to testify before the Education Committee on necessary reforms to the system of protection for special children in private schools. They're going to ask me about that morning, Kesha murmured, reading the invitation. About why I slept on the floor with Thomas. And what will you say? She smiled, but it wasn't the enigmatic smile of the early days. It was something new, lighter, more hopeful that sometimes dignity isn't about keeping your composure, but about doing what's right, even when everyone around you thinks you're crazy. The following week, the congressional hearing room was packed. Television cameras captured every word as Kesha, wearing a simple navy blazer, answered questions from congressmen with the same methodical calm she had displayed when exposing Patricia. Miss Johnson, said Congressman Williams, in your opinion, what is the biggest flaw in the current educational oversight system? The assumption that expensive schools automatically provide better care, Kesha replied bluntly. For 3 months, I documented an institution that charged $40,000 a year per child, but provided care inferior to that of any well-run public daycare center. And how do we change that? Radical transparency, quarterly surprise, audits, mandatory certified training for any professional working with special children, and most importantly, listen to the children. They know when they are being neglected. The testimony was broadcast nationally. 3 hours later, Kesha's office received 417 calls from parents, educators, and investors wanting to get involved with the Institute. Marcus, now a journalism graduate and working as the Institute's communications director, walked into the office with a stack of newspaper clippings. Sis, you've become a national reference on inclusive education. Harvard wants you to teach a course. Princeton has offered you a permanent chair. Kesha shook her head. I don't want to be a university professor. I want to continue working directly with the children. That night, she visited Thomas, now 16 months. Old, walking on his own and speaking his first words. Jonathan had hired 2 full-time specialized therapists and turned part of their mansion into a sensory development center. Thomas ran to her as soon as he saw her, his step still a little clumsy but determined. He only started talking after. You implemented the tactile communication protocol, Jonathan said, watching his son interact naturally with Kesha. 3 pediatricians said he would never speak before the age of 3. He just needed to feel safe enough to try, Kesha replied, kneeling down to Thomas's height. Special children aren't defective. They just navigate the world differently. A year after Patricia's arrest, Kesha received an unexpected letter. It was from her, written from prison. Kesha, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know that I finally understand what you were trying to protect. I met a woman here whose autistic daughter graduated from medical school thanks to a teacher who believed in her. I realized that I wasted 15 years trying to mold special children instead of adapting the world for them. I deeply regret the harm I caused. Kesha folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her drawer, not out of anger or satisfaction, but as a reminder that even people who commit cruel acts can eventually find redemption. During an interview on national television, the host asked, "Kesha, did you plan this revenge from day one?" "It wasn't revenge," she corrected gently. "It was documentation. When you see systematic injustice, you have two choices. Accept it as normal or document it meticulously until you have enough evidence to change it. I chose the latter. And what advice would you give to people facing similar situations?" Kesha looked directly into the camera. Strategic patience is more powerful than impulsive anger. Document everything. Find allies and remember, the best revenge is not destroying those who hurt you, but building something so important that the injustice you suffered becomes irrelevant. Today, 5 years after that morning when she slept on the floor with Thomas, Kesha runs an institute valued at $80 million, has been on the cover of Time magazine as Educator of the Year, and has trained more than 2,000 specialized teachers. Patricia remains in prison, working in the laundry and losing weight due to the stress of having destroyed her own life out of greed. The Kesha Johnson Institute has literally saved thousands of special children from educational neglect. And it all started because one woman decided that sleeping on the floor to comfort a child was more important than keeping up appearances for superiors who would never respect her anyway. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is not to repay the evil you have suffered, it is to turn your pain into purpose and build a legacy that your enemies could never imagine. If this story of transforming injustice into social impact has touched you, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that intelligence, documentation, and determination always win out over cruelty, prejudice, and arrogance in the long run. They trusted Priscilla, and look where that got them, Calvin replied. This could have been avoided if your board hadn't let her run unchecked. Clinton shifted his weight. Is there a way to resolve this without kicking people out of their homes? Calvin studied him for a moment. I'm not looking to throw anyone out who's willing to make things right. But I'm not letting this HOA pretend they didn't try to take what's mine. Meanwhile, Francis Doyle called again with news. The board had scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss removing Priscilla as president. The pressure from homeowners now facing rent payments was more than they could ignore. 3 nights later, that meeting ended in a vote. Priscilla was out. Wesley stepped down shortly after, citing personal reasons. Neither of them spoke publicly, but rumor had it both were consulting lawyers of their own. The shift in leadership changed the tone overnight. The new acting president, Sharon Bell, called Reed directly to propose a settlement. The HOA would issue a formal apology, acknowledge Calvin's rights to blocks 3 through 7, and agree never to contest his ownership of the 1,500 acres again. In return, Calvin would drop the landlord action against residents who signed rental acknowledgments within 30 days. It wasn't everything Calvin wanted. There'd be no admission of wrongdoing for the false abandonment claim, but it was a public surrender on the key points. Reed laid it out plainly. This deal puts your land back in your name, your rights in writing, and them in your debt. The rest you can win in reputation. Calvin thought about it overnight. By morning, he agreed not because he wanted to let the HOA off easy, but because his father had always told him to know when a fight was won. The day the agreement was signed, local news cameras rolled as Calvin stood at the courthouse steps. This isn't just about me, he told them. It's about standing up when someone in power thinks they can walk over you. You don't let that slide, not for a day, not for $1. As the cameras clicked, he noticed a few homeowners from the estates watching from the crowd. Some nodded in quiet acknowledgement, others still looked wary. Calvin knew trust wouldn't come overnight, But that wasn't his goal. His goal had been to protect what was his and make sure no one tried to take it again. But the story didn't quite end there, because the fallout from Priscilla's removal would ripple through Pine Bluff County in ways Calvin hadn't yet imagined. In the weeks that followed the agreement, Pine Bluff County felt different. You could sense it in the way people talked at the feed store and how conversations paused when Calvin walked into the hardware shop. Some looked at him with respect, others with suspicion, but no one looked at him like he was just another rancher anymore. Priscilla's absence from the HOA left a vacuum. Without her iron grip on decisions, homeowners began airing complaints. That had been ignored for years about rising fees, uneven enforcement of rules, and opaque spending. Sharon Bell tried to steer the board toward transparency, but the fractures ran deep. A handful of residents blamed her for caving to Calvin. One man even stood up at a meeting and shouted, "We got rolled over by one guy with a cowboy hat," and a grudge. Calvin heard about the comment the next day from Francis, who delivered it with a smirk. "Sounds like you've got a new nickname in the estates." "I've been called worse," Calvin replied, though privately he didn't like being seen as just a symbol of resistance. His fight had been about more than proving a point, it was about defending his family's legacy. Not everyone in the Bissawantontavin estates was bitter. Several residents from blocks 3 through 7 visited the ranch to meet Calvin face to face. One older couple, the Beldens, came with a homemade pecan pie. "We just wanted to thank you for not throwing us out," Mrs. Belden sighed, her voice quiet but steady. "We had no idea any of this was going on." "I know you didn't," Calvin told her. "The people you trusted put you in a bad spot. I'm not here to punish folks for the board's mistakes. I'm here to make sure it never happens again." Still, the settlement didn't erase every scar. The developer quietly pulled out of Pine Bluff Estates, but not before selling their stake in other parcels nearby. Rumor had it they were regrouping, looking for softer targets in other counties. Reed warned Calvin to stay alert. Once a company's played this kind of game, they don't stop, they just shift their sights. Meanwhile, Elena's article had taken on a life of its own. State papers picked it up, framing Calvin's fight as a rare example of an individual taking on both a homeowners association and a developer and winning. Calvin started getting letters in the mail from people across Texas, sharing their own stories of being bullied by HOAs or losing family land to technicalities. Some asked for advice. Others just wanted to say they were rooting for him. One letter stuck with him. It came from a man in Eastland County, whose grandparents had lost their farm in the 70s to a similar abandonment claim. He wrote, "We didn't know our rights, and we didn't have the means to fight. You did what we couldn't. Thank you." Calvin kept that letter in the same leather folder as his father's deeds. It was a reminder that this battle wasn't fought in isolation. The HOA, meanwhile, was forced to hold a community-wide meeting to explain the settlement terms. Sharon Bell read the prepared statement, acknowledging Calvin's rights to blocks 3 through 7 and confirming that the 1,500 acres were his alone. As she spoke, Calvin stood quietly at the back of the room. Some homeowners glanced at him with guarded expressions, others with relief. After the meeting, a younger homeowner named Eli Comack approached. "Mr. Rourke, I just wanted to say I didn't like you much when this started. I thought you were just trying to wreck our neighborhood. But after hearing everything, I get it now." Calvin gave a small nod. "That's all I needed you to do, get it." Life at the ranch slowly returned to its rhythms. Calvin spent mornings mending fences, afternoons tending the cattle, evenings on the porch with coffee. But every so often, he'd catch sight of the subdivision and the distance roofs and streetlights against the horizon, and remember that part of his land stretched beneath those homes. Not in a way that made him smug, but as a quiet reminder of the balance he'd fought to restore. In town, people were still talking about the case months later. For some, it became a cautionary tale about overreaching power. For others, a rallying cry for protecting property rights. Either way, Calvin knew his name would be tied to this fight for a long time. But as the dust settled in Pine Bluff County, Calvin found himself thinking less about the fight behind him and more about the lesson it left, a truth his father had lived by, and one he was determined to pass on. And please subscribe my YouTube channel.